Welcome to the Digital Humanities Virtual Hour series at ASU. For those that don't know me, I'm Liz Grumbach, the Manager of Digital Humanities and Research at the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and the Program Lead for Digital Humanities Initiative at the Institute for Humanities Research. First, thank you to our co-sponsoring institutions for bringing us together today to learn and be in discussion. I'd urge you to explore the amazing work that both the Institute for Humanities Research and the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics are doing at Arizona State University. And before we kick off our virtual hour and introduce our speaker, I, as always, have a few housekeeping things and some virtual hour guidelines. First, be sure to grab a pen and paper or have a notes document open on your computer for today's workshop. We're together today in a Zoom meeting and the chat has been turned on, so please feel free to use chat to say hello, hype our speaker today, and connect with each other. These virtual hours are intended to foster discussion, and we have a small group today, so it should be an awesome discussion. There are intentional breaks for questions in today's workshop, but please feel free to pose questions at any time during the event, mainly using chat, but also the raise hand function. Please note that portions of this presentation will be recorded and posted online. You'll get a verbal Zoom warning that the recording has started and stopped, but we'll also cue you in case you'd like to turn your camera off for any reason. And computer-generated captions will be turned on for this event momentarily. If you have any issues activating it, please let me know in chat and we'll troubleshoot. And finally, and most important, the thing I say before every single one of our virtual hours is that our digital humanities at ASU events have always been a feminist and an anti-racist space, and this applies to our virtual events as well. Harassment and discrimination are not tolerated here, but most importantly, our digital humanities community operates from a place of care. We support one another's work, safety, and livelihood, and that support is ever more important as we continue to deal with new and old challenges. And with our housekeeping concluded, it is my pleasure to introduce our workshop leader, Purdom Lindblad. Purdom is the Assistant Director of Innovation and Learning at the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, MIT. She coordinates MIT's growing portfolio of courses and instructional programs and is a member of the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities team, or ADHUM. Purdom has an MA in American Studies from Michigan State University and an MS in Information Science from the School of Information, University of Michigan. Interested in digital humanities since graduate school, Purdom has worked at Michigan State University's Matrix, Virginia Tech Libraries, and the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia. Purdom is broadly interested in the implicit and explicit effort that digital humanities can do for social, cultural, and environmental justice. Applying principles from feminist interface design, Purdom and her Scholars Lab colleague, Jeremy Boggs, explore how the process of feature development and public documentation shape the experience of users and render the theoretical underpinnings of digital work more accessible. Recent publications include Praxis, a keyword in the MLA Commons Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, as well as a chapter in Making Humanities Matter. And for those of y'all that were present for Purdom's amazing lecture yesterday, you know I must add a personal note here. I've had the pleasure of being in community with Purdom for over a decade, where she has been a central figure in the digital and archival spaces that I've gravitated towards in this profession. I've only recently had the opportunity to call her a collaborator, but her work in the field has been influential and an inspiration. And I am really honored that you are here to spend time with us today and this week, Purdom. For those of you that missed her lecture yesterday, that will be posted on the Lincoln Center YouTube channel in the next 24 hours, along with her lecture notes. And now I will turn the mic over to you, Purdom.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. It is amazing, as always, to be together with you. So let me pull up my screen because I have a couple of notes, but because it's a small workshop and these are some ideas that I'm really just starting to try out in terms of like how to think about project management. It's very informal and I very much encourage like interruptions, questions, conversations. Actually, let me pull up my slide and I will not say this until in a minute, but let me do this. Because I write down everything or I go off script and then, you know, it's forever. Okay. All right. So is everyone able to see the screen okay? So this workshop is aspirationally titled Minimal Computing as Reparative Practice, and I will either help comfort you or terrify you, because we won't be doing any coding today, but we will be working with paper and pen. And as my colleague Jeremy Boggs often says, the minute that you want to like scare a bunch of humanists is to hand them a blank paper and a bunch of colored pencils. So hopefully we'll approach this in a spirit of adventure. But I think first what I'd like to do is some introductions. And so thank you again for spending the next bit of time together. And as again, if you haven't had the opportunity to gather paper or any kind of writing utensils, please do so. You're welcome to take notes digitally, but in my experience, paper and pencil is extremely helpful, in part because you can kind of draw on things, you can add color or notes or stickers. If you get really ambitious, there's like all kinds of textiles you could add to your stuff. As a way of like helping you think. But if you are committed to your digital notes, feel free to do that too. Okay, so you'll see an outline a little bit on the screen of what we were going to plan to do. And again, it's highly interruptible. This notion for project management for wild ideas, or sort of a good enough project management, I've been talking with colleagues at the Scholars Lab, particularly Brandon Walsh, Amanda Visconti, Laura Miller, and Rhonda, who I'm losing her last name right now. She's going to kill me, so we'll edit that out, I hope. But we've been talking about the different kinds of consulting that we've done for graduate students, for faculty who are thinking about a project, but they're not really committed to a really big project that's seeking grant funding. They're not particularly committed to a project that has like a really clear outline yet. It's just, what if? And so we were trying to think about what are the sort of minimal practices that you might engage with those wild ideas, so that if at any point it becomes a place to really grapple with like wrangling it into a grant application or wrangling it into a dissertation topic, there's substantial support already in place for you to do that. But before we get into it, I think that it would be really useful to have some introductions. And I will say that Zoom is never smooth. So we'll embrace the awkwardness for at least the next hour and a half. And so please feel free to change your name to your preferred name. If you're familiar with Zoom, I'm sure you already know it's in the upper right-hand corner, the little dots. You can rename yourself, change your background, etc. So again, I do have some notes that I have written down because I tend to like go wildly off script if I'm not careful. But I will try not to make it sound so reedy, and please do, if there is a space that we would like to spend a little more time on, please do like unmute yourself and to just speak up. So as I mentioned, I'm interested in like memory and speculation, particularly at the backdrop or against the backdrop of like catastrophic climate change, really thinking about where investments in repair are desperately needed. And thinking mostly the questions that are guiding me are like, how do we reckon with the stewardship of memory, particularly memory dislodged from place, as global warming and capitalism lead to displacements of people, increased war, oppression, exploitation of some ecologies and people over the protection of others. And so in reaction to the erasure of certain lives and histories and memories from the archival record, I'm led quite a bit by Saida Hartman, who employs a critical fabulation. And she uses this like notion of a critical storytelling, a critical imagining of different potentials and possibilities. Or I kind of think of them as abeyant records, like records that have never been created, but they're longed for, or records that re-embody marginalized accounts or subjugated knowledge through these acts of imagination. And I'm particularly interested in not only like, how do we think through like what the possibilities for an archival record might include, but what tools do we employ to grapple with these kinds of archival erasures. And that includes like, not only like what are the shape of archives, whether they're intentional or accidental or speculative. I'm particularly interested in like the Great Garbage Patch as a kind of archive of human activity. But what are the processes that help us identify that there are potential records, and then think through the ways in which we collect them, we name them, we describe them, that can restore those records to a broader audience, but also begin to acknowledge the harm that's been done in the past and start to repair. And no repair is even. In fact, I really love the visible repair movement, in part to leave the trace, the scar, the notion that it has been repaired, that it's not healed completely, and it's not the same as it once was, but there is an attempt to reconcile or attempt to repair it. And I am also led by Donna Haraway, who has argued in Staying with the Troubles or Sitting with the Troubles, that there's a need to create and nurture places of refuge. And I'm very interested in what this looks like in an actual practice. And like, what does that look like in project management? What does that look like in building a digital humanities thing or working on a minimal computing project? And so it does sound a little crazy to suggest that mundane things such as project management or computing, one computing approach over others might help get us towards a response to these questions. But I think that there are reparative practices held within each that ask us not to completely upend our traditional workflows, but to reframe them, to situate them in some way. And that there's a way that these kinds of practices of project management and working with static sites help us reflect on what's important about our work and the ways in which we share this work. And so I want to say that there are several, and the few that are on your screen are just a selection of some of my favorite project management tools for digital humanities. So these are excellent, thinking about like, how do you nail down a scope? What are the kinds of technical considerations do you need? What are the kinds of staffing considerations you need? But all of these are really big. These are meant for like larger multi-team projects. So what about a small project? What about a project that only exists in like the wisp of a fragment of a dream? I think about a lot of things like Sir Ken Richardson wrote a book on like creativity in children and how we essentially like school creativity out of children. And if you ask an adult to name the as many possible uses for a paperclip as you can, you have like 3 answers, 5 answers if somebody's really creative. But with kids, you get like, well, what if the paperclip is 6 feet tall and made of foam? And I have always remembered that and have always like returned to that. It's like, okay, well, what if whatever we're doing is, 6 feet tall and made of foam? So what kinds of project management approaches and strategies can kind of grab a hold of those wild ideas or these small nascent ideas, and then help us begin to keep track or make note of what should be accounted for and what should be tracked. So I'm going to pause really quickly and check oh, good. Thanks, Liz, for adding to the chat. I'm just going to kind of keep it a light eye on it. Okay. So with some Scholars Lab colleagues, as I mentioned, like Rhonda Grizzle, thank you for her last name, Amanda Visconti, Brandon Walsh, and Laura Miller, we've been talking through like what counts for like good enough project management. And right now I am thinking about sort of 3 broad things. You need some kind of system for organizing your stuff, a method for taking notes and tracking the decisions. And this one I think is actually the most important. You need some co-conspirators. And we'll be able to kind of think through like the details of these kinds of broad buckets of things. But I think that one of the things I want to spend a little time on today is like the idea of being able to find things later, to keep track of like why this particular idea is great, along with all of the possibilities of how it might manifest itself in the world. And then where you might lean in on trading skills or ideas. And so these are like the keeping track of your stuff and co-conspirators. And I'm particularly invested in rethinking repair as a mode of practice. And so I lean on Jeremy Boggs and I have been working on an idea or framework called advocacy by design to help surface some of the most important aspects of a piece of work or a kind of idea. And I always get really excited and like emphasize the what's most important, but I do want to kind of underscore that it's not particularly what's most important for the field or for the discipline, but more about your own passion or my, speaking as a me, like my own passions, like what about this idea feeds me? I often give it a kind of a litmus test, not a do what you love, because I think that has some kind of wonky edges, but more like what within the work that you're interested in doing that restores you, particularly on like the most awful, terrible, no good day, right? Like what is it that pulls you back the next day when you've had a day of challenging meetings, your emails piling up, and the one simple technical thing that you're trying to do like crashes your entire computer? Like so rather than like flipping the table and just giving up, like what is it about the work that you're doing that you come back to it? Um, and so to kind of help surface this, we draw on Frank Chimero's design theory, and he often argues that we should seek the why. So why this work, why these materials, why this particular moment? And so I think that our first design exercise is a bit of a list. It's list making. And so as Chimero has stated, it's easier to ask, how do I paint this tree? Rather than why should this painting have a tree in it? And I think this is like one of the sort of horrible, lovely questions that anyone has been asked if you come to a digital consultant or a digital librarian or a digital center on campus and you're like, I have this great idea. And inevitably you will get some polite version of why is your digital project important? And so rather than getting like pulled in by a shiny technology or a shiny approach, or an interesting interface, like the kinds of things that the response would be like, this work fulfills this kind of need, or this work like opens up a discussion, or it extends a kind of story that really needs to be told. And it doesn't have to be a huge why, it doesn't have to be ground shaking, but I think that having like a really clear why helps you not only identify how to locate your co-conspirators, but also to justify the time, the work. It helps you identify what kind of materials you need, and what kind of manipulations those materials need to go have done in order to kind of tell that story in a robust way. And I think the other question is like, why does your work need to be digital? So my mom is taking this paper class, and the next workshop I want to take or give is like how to make pop-up books for humanists, because her stuff is amazing. And so I think that this question of like, why is this digital is also a really important question to sit with. Okay, so that's all of my talking. So for the next 5 minutes, we're gonna like draft out our whys. So why this topic? Why this research? Why this particular method or tool? And this can be in words and images and symbols and songs. It does not have to be exhaustive. If you have a particular set of lists or ideas around one of these prompts, or if this prompt prompts a different thought for you, make a list in there. But like the goal of this exercise is to like really narrow in on that why. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start the timer, and Liz will stop the recording, and we'll cue up some quiet music, and we'll kind of generate a few lists for the next like 5 minutes. And you're welcome to turn your camera off if you would like. So once we have a concrete why, that then begins to help us think a little bit about what are the kinds of materials that we might encounter or use to kind of help support our arguments or our research interests. And so we're going to do a little bit more list making, but the lists generated here begin to sketch out the basics of your metadata. So again, like metadata is sort of data about data. So it talks about like who created this object, what kind of object is it, when was it made, are there other kinds of descriptions about this thing? But these kinds of descriptions, this kind of metadata, some of them can be used to help locate things. So some of the metadata, particularly your control vocabulary, or your descriptive terms, or your subject terms, can be used in minimal computing to sort and browse. And so, you might hear the term, you might hear the vocabulary of like subject terms or control vocabularies, and you've seen them in action. If you've seen tags, if you've seen word clouds, if you've seen it when you've like searched for something in the library catalog, and then there's like a linked list underneath that has like, you know, women writers of the 19th century or whatever it is that you're kind of thinking or researching, it has the linked, those are the subject terms. But within this is this very subtle but an enormous power. So like when you're deciding your subject terms, you're crafting not only how others will find your items, but how they will understand them. I have some friends who work at the University of Houston for the Arts of Publico, and they do the USLDH. So it's a Latinx digital humanities initiative. And I was at a conversation that they were hosting, and one participant brought up that when they try to create the Library of Congress subject terms for Piñata, the way in which it's described is as a vessel, which completely obscures what an actual piñata is. And so this is like one very brief and not very detailed example of like where not only are you deciding the term in which someone will find something, but also like the cultural and significance of something. And if it's misdescribed, that's a problem. And so for this exercise, we're going to be, again, making some lists, but these are terms or sentence fragments. And again, this is not a stress test. You do not have to do them all. So you can select one prompt that resonates, or you can select a couple of prompts. But what we want to do is generate different terms and different kinds of materials that will support your research. So if you have a project in mind, what are the materials that you're already anticipating working with, or you are already working with? And what are the terms that you might use to describe them? So the prompts are who created each asset. So you might think about if it was an individual person or a particular community, you can go at any level. And you might want to think about how are the creators or others represented in each asset. An asset is a technical term for like the stuff that you're working with. You know, it could be a diary, it could be a letter, it could be photographs, it could be a variety of different things. But what is each thing? What is it highlighting, and how might you use it? What's most important about these things? And in an ideal state, what search terms would you use to find this thing? And so again, I'll kind of pause. I think I'm going to stop sharing. Is that right, Liz? And then we'll stop the recording. I'll set the timer for 5 minutes, and then we'll kind of think through how we think about the materials that we work with. Okay, so I'm going to stop. Oh, thanks, Liz. So thinking about like minimal computing is working with technical systems that use very stable coding languages. So HTML, which provides like basic structure to a web page, CSS, which is shorthand for cascading style sheets. And it's essentially how you make things pretty. And then JavaScript is how it's a language that helps like create interactive spaces. And that's highly simplified. And there are a couple of like new and interesting things with CSS that makes it even lighter and easier. But just for our purposes today, we have these sort of very stable technologies that are essentially the same from the late 90s to now. And there's been different updates, but the core of it is the same. It's very stable. There's a lot of user communities around them. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have minimal dependencies, meaning that you don't have to install a lot of other things in order to have them work on your computer. And that there's an attention to resource consumption. So minimal computing is a framework to think about not only the environmental costs of computing work, which if you ever need some like nightmare fuel, you can go look at the environmental cost of server farms. It's terrifying. So it's thinking about the environmental costs, but also the cost of access. So in the United States, most places you do not have to pay for the amount of data you're accessing when you go online, but that's not true for many countries. And so in countries that have sort of a cost of access, or there is a low connectivity situation in any space where the internet is up and down, or it's not always stable. So minimal computing is trying to think about the cost of access to websites or the internet completely. And so how do we design to make access more equitable and easier for a variety of different environments and locations? We're also thinking when we're talking about minimal computing about like minimal maintenance. I've mentioned a couple of times over the last couple of days that, how do we design and build things that can weather periods of change, periods of neglect? If you leave it, somewhere on your computer for 6 months, and then you get a passionate, burst of energy, and you come back to it, and you remember where you were, like, do you have to do a lot to get that sort of the technical infrastructure of the project back online, essentially? So how do we build in minimal maintenance? And attached to that is how do we reduce obsolescence? Kathleen Fitzpatrick has written an amazing book called Planned Obsolescence, in terms of like how certain kinds of technical objects the death date is built into them. And sometimes that can be a really good thing. It's really important if you know that you're building a project. It might be really useful to say, this is a project that will live for 5 years, and then I'm going to sunset it. And so some pieces will be available as a record of this project, but the actual maintained and sort of hands-on active development of that site is not going to happen anymore. I think in the digital humanities, we have these aspirations for like projects that live for like 20, 30, 50 years. And, that's okay, that's great, but I think some projects really need to live for a brief moment, do the work that they're meant to do, and then kind of really think carefully about the record they wish to leave behind, and then be sunsetted. But that's a different lecture. But so essentially all of these ideas are sort of embedded into the term minimal computing. And so what we're working on is to really think about who has access, how access works in low connectivity environments. And we're also thinking about reducing surveillance or dependence on outside vendors. So essentially this comes down to a question of like, Alex Heal frames it as like, do you own the means of your own scholarly production? And so you can think through like, how do you maintain as a creator your intellectual property rights and the control in which your content is being published and framed. So if you think about, and maybe this is actually a question for discussion, and we'll kind of keep it as a shorter discussion. There are different kinds of websites that are what they call a WYSIWYG. It's an abbreviation of what you see is what you get. So like Wix or Squarespace, you can drop your content in and you can have within a couple of hours a really beautiful site. But why would you want to labor on a minimal computing site where you have to sort of begin to get a handle on HTML and CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, or get comfortable working on documents on your computer and thinking about where things live on your computer versus on a server somewhere? So why would you choose a static site or a minimal computing site rather than like Squarespace or something even like WordPress or a Mecca, which are two content management systems? So let me pause and we'll open that up for discussion. So one thing with minimal computing is it can be as simple as a spreadsheet for your metadata and a template such as Collection Builder, which I know I feel like I'm pitching Collection Builder. They have not asked me to. It's just a really great a great framework, and it's highly customizable, so that with minimal technical skills, you can create a very usable and very attractive site for yourself or for your project. And with any kind of static site, there are elements such as navigation, headers, footers, even timelines or maps that you can customize. And so the last exercise, I think, I had it for two, but I think we'll just do one exercise, is we will be doing a paper paste prototyping. And so we'll look over the generated terms that you've created, and on a blank piece of paper, we'll take probably 3 minutes, we'll do it fast, and kind of sketch some of the relationships between the materials, your subject terms, and how you think the relationships might emerge. So you can use this slide as inspiration. This is Anne Burdick and Margot Dunlap's exercises based on Joanna Drucker's visual epistemologies. or you can stick to just like squares for images and straight lines for text or stick figures. But you're welcome to develop your own visual vocabulary to kind of think about, if you can imagine a browse page and the subject terms that you've generated, how are they related to each other, or the people that are part of your collection?